So good evening. This is part 3 of Cooking Matters, and we have Jesse Henderson Delgado, as well as Taylor Hargis as our presenters today. If you attended the other 2 sessions, they were our presenters then too. And so I won't give you all of their introduction, but I will want to say thank you to you guys. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you. This class is always a pleasure. So for tonight's class, since we are a week out from Thanksgiving, we're just going to be talking strictly about Thanksgiving. So we're going to share some holiday meal ideas that are a little bit healthier, recognizing that the holidays are definitely a time to celebrate and enjoy your favorite foods, but also just sharing some ideas for having a healthier Thanksgiving. Just going to pull up our presentation real quick. So these are our objectives today. So we're going to share some healthy holiday meal ideas. We're also going to touch a little bit about recipe frameworks. I know we've talked about that in previous classes, but we're just going to kind of review some substitution ideas. And then we're also just going to talk a little bit about making holiday meals a little less stressful and fun for the whole family, because that's what it should be. And because all of our recipe demos tonight do take a little bit longer to cook than most of our previous ones, we're going to cook first, and then we'll talk about everything else afterwards. So I just pulled this up, but I'm going to pull it back down, and I will meet you all in my kitchen very shortly.
I just want to also talk for a second about, we celebrate as Americans Thanksgiving, but not every person in America celebrates Thanksgiving. So we do also want to honor and recognize all the Indigenous people here in this country too, while we're talking about Thanksgiving. For them, it's less celebratory, but it's always been my favorite holidays because I like to remember to count my blessings, and so that's the way I look at it. I don't always like to pull on the historical part of it, but just as long as we recognize and honor all of our native people here as well, we can still celebrate. And Taylor, I see you're there.
Agreed. And also, these don't just have to be Thanksgiving recipes, obviously. I feel like in general, the holiday season is one where we tend to indulge a lot, which I think to a certain extent is definitely warranted. But we're just trying to remake some of our favorite holiday recipes and make them a little bit healthier. So we're going to talk in depth a little bit more later towards the end of class about just different things that we tend to make around the holiday season in general. But I just want to start with a couple of my favorite holiday recipes that I found that are a little bit healthier than the ones I probably grew up with. So the first version that we're going to make is a healthier version of a sweet potato casserole. And this one I did send in your handouts, so it's a good one to try if you do sweet potatoes. So that'll be our first recipe demo, and then Jesse has some other ones as well. So just so y'all know, I pre-roasted all of my sweet potatoes because that took about like an hour or so. So these are roasted. What I did for these was I just washed my sweet potatoes. I pierced them a couple of times with a fork just to make sure any moisture could escape without them exploding all over my oven. And then I roasted them at 425 for about 45 minutes. So these are ready to go. So for this recipe, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to get my sweet potatoes into my bowl here. Also, if you've been in previous classes, I have moved since then, so my kitchen isn't quite as nice. I mean, it's still nice. It's just not as set up as well as my last kitchen was for demos. So I might have to run back and forth a little bit. So I apologize about that, but hopefully you can still see everything. So I'm just going to cut these sweet potatoes open to start with. Also, even if it's not the holidays, I would definitely recommend, if you've never tried it before, just roasting sweet potatoes because they are delicious on their own. I used to do this all the time, just as like a very low effort meal, was just like roast some sweet potatoes and pair it with like a protein. So definitely a good thing to have. I'm gonna be honest and say that I overcooked mine a little bit. The way that you can tell that your roasted sweet potatoes are done is that the skin kind of starts to separate from the rest of the potato. As you can see, mine, well, they're not that bad. Some of them looked a little if you look on the inside, the skin had started to burn just a tiny bit, but the actual like flesh of the sweet potato itself is still really good. So it really brings out like the sweetness of the sweet potatoes. And as you all probably know, sweet potatoes are a little bit more nutritious than just like regular potatoes. They're a really good source of vitamin A and vitamin C and some other things as well. So I'm going to start by cutting all my potatoes in half so that I can kind of just scoop out the flesh. And I'm going to go grab a spoon real quick. I'll be right back. And once sweet potatoes are roasted, honestly, sometimes you can kind of just squeeze them out and all of it comes out really easily. I just got my spoon as backup. So we're going to squeeze. I used about 5 potatoes, 5 sweet potatoes, and this will make about 8 servings. If you're cooking for a larger family, you may need to use more, just as an FYI. Also, if you're cooking these and you are not using them for like a casserole recipe, the skin of the sweet potatoes is actually totally fine to eat, and I have done that before in the past. It may be a little off-putting, but you can do it if you would like to. There are some nutrients in the skin, as there are with most fruits and vegetables. So. So traditionally speaking, when I was growing up, sweet potato casserole was always like super sweet. It was always like covered in marshmallows, which was good, but it was like you could only eat a very small serving of it before it kind of made you nauseous. This is a good alternative. It still has a good amount of sweetness, but it's just a little bit healthier and doesn't have as much added sugar, because sweet potatoes themselves already have a decent amount of natural sugar. So they're really sweet and tasty. And they really don't need to be covered in additional added sugar as well. All right, so I got all my sweet potatoes in my bowl, and then I'm going to add, I'm gonna go wash my hands real quick. I'll be right back.
And if you guys have other favorite sweet potato recipes, put them in the chat.
So I'm going to add 2.5 tablespoons of maple syrup. So maple syrup is obviously like a sweetener, but it does have some additional like healthy things in it because it is natural. So it can be a good alternative just to adding sugar. And it does have a really nice flavor too. So I have my maple syrup, and then I'm gonna add some milk. So for this recipe, the recipe that I sent calls for almond milk, but you can use any milk. I'm just gonna use some oat milk today, but you could also use regular milk. Also gonna go grab my liquid measuring cup. So I'm gonna add 1/2 cup of my milk. And then you can add an egg if you want. It'll kind of help everything like cohese together. I'm gonna skip that today because I don't have eggs in my kitchen. So it's another example of just kind of going along with the flow and making recipes work for you. Then I'm gonna add some cinnamon. It calls for a teaspoon, but I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it because cinnamon is delicious. And then it calls for 1/4 or a pinch of allspice. So if you are cooking for multiple people, I would recommend kind of dumping it into your hand and choosing a pinch from there. That way you're not inserting your hand directly into your spice jar there. And then I don't have nutmeg, which is what the recipe calls for, so I'm going to use a little bit of cloves instead. So I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of the cloves. And then also a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So you'll usually see salt in pretty much anything that you're gonna like bake or that's sweet, which I think can sometimes be a little bit surprising, but it does kind of help balance out the flavors and kind of make that a little bit more even. Okay, so the top of my salt doesn't come off apparently. So I'm gonna eyeball this one as well. And then one thing I did forget to grab, which I'll go grab in just a second, is vanilla extract. I don't have vanilla extract either, so I'm going to use some just vanilla bean paste, and I'll go grab that and be right back.
And so in our last class, you guys asked about making baby food. So whichever foods we have already introduced to our child in this recipe, if they have not had oat milk yet before and you're not ready to introduce that to your child, it wouldn't be a good idea. But if you do, if they've had a sweet potato before and you know they're not allergic to it, you can take one of those sweet potatoes right out of the recipe, and instead of putting it in the casserole, make your little baby food on the side right out of that, and you wouldn't need a blender for things like sweet potatoes.
All right, so I have all of my like basic ingredients in here. I am gonna use an electric mixer just to mix it all together. But the sweet potatoes are so soft if you're being roasted that you really don't need to use this if you don't have one. It just makes it a little bit easier. I like other side of the mixer guy doesn't want to go in here though. It's fine. We'll just use one. We're just going to blend this all together. And that would also be a good thing to use if you are going to make baby food with the sweet potatoes, is just use your mixer if you don't have a blender, because it basically turns it into like the same consistency, just without all the extra added stuff.
If you were feeding a younger baby, you could add like take some of it out and add a little bit of water, because like really early baby food is more watery, and then as they start getting teeth and chewing and learning how to use their mouth, you can give them the less, like more potato, less water.
So for this, I'm just going to decide for now. And then we're going to make our topping, which is kind of like a crumble topping. So for this one, I'm going to use a 1/4 cup of flour. I'm going to use whole wheat flour for the whole grain. Since we're not really baking it, it's not going to really affect the consistency as much. I'm going to add a 1/3 cup of whole wheat flour, or not whole wheat flour, sorry. I'm going to add a 1/3 cup of oats. So I'm just using old-fashioned oats, but you could use any oats you have that are plain. And then we're gonna add a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. I am almost out of brown sugar, but I think I have definitely enough for this. So for this one, we're gonna pack the brown sugar. So basically, if you don't do a lot of baking, that means when I put it in our measuring cup, I'm just gonna kind of pack it down because the brown sugar will take up less space then. So you want it to be packed and not just scooping it into your brown sugar like bag or jar and calling it good to go. And then I'm also gonna add a 1/2 cup of chopped pecans. So I just got pecans from the baking aisle, which generally are gonna be cheaper than the ones you get in the snack aisle. And these ones are also already chopped for me, so I don't have to do that, which is kind of nice. So I only have a 1/4 cup, so I'm gonna add 2 1/4 cups. And then for my last ingredient, I'm gonna add 3 tablespoons of melted butter. So for melted butter, I usually just like to put it in the microwave for like 20 seconds or so and just kind of keep an eye on it because it'll melt pretty quickly. So my microwave is to the left here. I'll be right over here to melt this real quick.
And then for this recipe, pecans are really sweet and delicious. They're a little bit more expensive, so you can use not the whole half nuts, but the little tiny crumbled up pieces are sometimes cheaper. And then walnuts are sometimes cheaper, but you definitely want to include the brown sugar if you're using walnuts because they're not quite as sweet.
Also, the nuts kind of, if you are using like regular butter, they kind of work with kind of balancing out the fat and making it a little bit more healthier. I did not keep a good enough eye on my butter and it started popping all over my microwave, but that's okay. All right, so then I'm just gonna add my melted butter here. Just give this a good stir. You could also, if your family doesn't like butter, you could also use like coconut oil. It works pretty much the same. So basically you just want to mix this until everything's kind of, you can't really see the flour by itself anymore. It's all kind of mixed in there together. And the oats are whole grain as well. So this entire topping, all of the grain products are whole grain. All right, so this is basically what the end result of the topping will look like. And then we're gonna take our baking dish. I'm just gonna spray it down. Then add my sweet potato mixture here. This is also, I've made this before and kind of made it ahead of time and just reheated it, and it works really well. So especially if you're like hosting Thanksgiving dinner, I feel like sometimes it can be really stressful to feel like you have to cook like 5 different things in one oven and try to kind of plan the time around it. So this is a good one to make ahead of time, and just kind of keep in your fridge and reheat just right before dinner. Because the consistency still turns out really well. So I'm just gonna make an even layer with my sweet potatoes. And I'm just gonna add my topping on top of that. And I'm gonna throw this in the oven at 350 for about 30-ish minutes. So I'm gonna pop this in the oven. I'm gonna turn it over to Jessie to show our next recipe, and then I'll show y'all when this is done.
So we have acorn squash. The reason why I picked out acorn squash is we were at that free farmers market last month for Halloween, and they had tons and tons of this. And there's a bunch of super good recipes for these. I have a new favorite that we'll talk about at the end of class, but this is my last favorite that I found for acorn squash. When I was a kid, my mom would just cut these in half and pack them full of butter and brown sugar. So I found this recipe that we're going to do tonight when I was looking for a healthier one other than that. It is delicious with butter and brown sugar, but there's plenty of cool festive ways we can make it. So the hardest part about the acorn squash is cutting it in half. Okay, so there's a couple tips to help with that. It has all these little bumpy ridges here. Okay, so you're going to go in the center of the ridge. You're going to put your knife in and you're going to cut towards the bottom. If this was the bottom point, you would cut towards the bottom point. It gets softer at this end. At this end, it's a lot harder. Okay, so when you go that way, you can get right through it. And then once you're about halfway through, then you can use your force. This is not something you'd want the kids to do, but you can push down on both sides of your knife to get it all the way open. We did this with little ones. We thought we would do cute little ones for our stuffed squash recipe we did in another class, and the smaller they are, the harder they are to cut open. Okay, so I'm gonna do half of the squash. I'm gonna save the other half for the stuffed squash recipe that we learned the other night. That was so good. I'm going to scrape out the seeds, of course. These are same like pumpkin seeds. I found out you can actually roast and eat these just like you can a pumpkin seed. So it's funny because the stuffed squash recipe calls for pumpkin seeds. And we bought them, and then I realized, oh, you could probably roast these and use them instead. If someone has their favorite roasting pumpkin seeds recipe, put that in the chat. The big debate with my other intern was if we want the seeds slimy or you want them all the way clean. I like them slimy. My husband likes them clean. And then with he puts lots of garlic salt on them. Okay, so for this recipe, we're going to use, you can use the whole squash, but I'm just going to use the half of the squash, and I'm going to cut it in flat side down so it's not rolling around. And then we're going to just do little semicircles. And again, this squash is really hard. So I'm going to, keeping my thumb out of the way, I'm going to keep pressing on this and just do really thin slices all the way through. Okay. And this is another roasted vegetable recipe. So really the way we're going to cook this, you can do any vegetable this way: carrots, potatoes, Brussels sprouts, really pretty much any dense vegetable. If you guys have a favorite roasted vegetable recipe, you can put that in the chat. Mine is Brussels sprouts. I love roasted Brussels sprouts. Okay, so that's the hardest part of this recipe, is cutting that in half. Okay, then we have these cute little semicircles, and I leave the skin on. The skin, you can eat it, but it gets really hard when it bakes in the oven. So I put a lot of oil on the outside, or else I eat the parts that are soft and then I kind of pull out the crunchier parts, which I know doesn't sound very appetizing, but that's how I do it. So we're just going to toss all these in a bowl. And just like any vegetable that we roast, we are going to add some oil. Oh, the start of the recipe, before class started, I put the oven at, what does this one say? 425. Okay. So you don't want too much extra oil, but you do want it to coat everything. Okay. And now these ingredients sound strange to me, but when I tried it, I was in love. So we're going to do thyme. And if you guys, I don't know if I showed you this last time, I showed it to a couple classes, but it's my favorite Facebook hack that I've learned, my newest kitchen hack, is to get the little herbs off of the stems. You're going to put the end of the stem through the tip of the colander and then pull it through, and all those little leaves come right off. So I did that a bunch with the thyme. For the thyme, I needed the really fine colander, but it works really good for cilantro. So my only other way to do cilantro easy before was make the kids do it. But this new Facebook hack is super awesome. And it totally works. Okay, so I'm going to chop up my thyme just a little bit, a rough chop. I really like my herbs whole, and they get cooked down in the oven for a little bit anyway. So about a tablespoon of chai. Of course, we remember our garlic trick is putting the knife away from us and point it down and smashing it to get the skin off. Okay, I'm going to mince this up very, very small. You can even use garlic powder. You can use any Italian seasoning. It doesn't have to be thyme. So oregano, Italian mix. The Italian mix one was really good. Parsley. Whoop, I'm not demonstrating good knife skills right now. Sorry. So yeah, any Italian herb. Thyme is just my favorite. Okay. Since I'm only doing a quarter of the squash, I'm only going to do about a 1 tablespoon of Parmesan. And it says to grate fresh Parmesan cheese, but this and the recipe, the jarred one is just as good. So I have half a tablespoon, 1 whole tablespoon, a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. And then we just toss that, spread it out on a baking sheet so they're apart from each other, so they're not all crammed in together. And then throw it in the oven. And this says for 15 minutes. So for me, I usually cook it about 30 minutes. Oh no, I have a different recipe than the one we sent you. The one we sent you is better. This one, it says, put it in the oven for 15 minutes, sprinkle the Parmesan on, and then put it in for another 15 minutes. Okay. Okay, so we have all of our, I don't know if you guys can see that well. All of our squash covered in oil and herbs all the way around. You want the oil to be over every part of the vegetable, and especially the skin. Okay, and then that just is going to go on a baking sheet, and it's going to go straight in the oven at 425 for half an hour. So I have to take off my headphones to do this, but you guys can still watch. They can't be in a pile, they got to be spread out real far apart. The Parmesan really makes this recipe good. Okay, so we don't crowd our cookie sheet. We spread it all out so there's an even amount so everything can really roast and get really crispy. The other acorn squash recipe we just took quinoa. We made quinoa with chicken broth. I think I've taught you guys all how to do that before. We added Mexican cheese like queso fresco, pepitas, cranberries, and herbs, and mix that all together and put that in the squash, which is what I'm going to do with this other half, and put that in the oven just enough to toast it up, and it's absolutely delicious. So these are very savory, buttery kind of squash recipes. You can make like an Asian or curry squash, like a pumpkin curry with these as well too. Any questions about this recipe? Okay, so we have apple slices with the squash. That would be really, really good with this recipe. Yeah, so squash soup is really good. I thought this squash, the way it came out all buttery, would make a really good risotto too. You just add it while the water is still in the rice. You just keep adding your vegetables and add a little bit of water at a time to make a risotto, because this was so buttery, it'd make a really good risotto. Okay, I won't go through the whole chat. I can do the stuffing, or Taylor, if you're ready, you can do your next one.
Ready? Oh, I'm ready.
Okay.
So one thing I did want to mention real quick, my favorite squash this time of the year is a Delicata squash. So if you've never tried it before, I would definitely recommend trying it. Some of the things that I really like about this one are it's really easy to cut. So I personally found squash intimidating for a really long time because they're really hard to cut. So this one's a lot smaller. The skin's a lot thinner. So it's much easier. So that's a big plus. It's also usually really affordable. I feel like it's kind of underrated. So I got 2 squashes from Trader Joe's for $1. And you can also leave the skin on. So I usually just roast these with a little bit of seasoning, and I just leave the skin on, and the skin is so thin that you can just eat it as is. But it also, if you take out all the seeds and you take out the skin as well, it kind of tastes like pumpkin. So I feel like sometimes towards the end of the holiday season, pumpkin becomes harder and harder to find. So this is a good substitution as well. And I promise you, no one will notice if you're making a pumpkin pie or something and using some Delicata squash. So would recommend if you've never tried before. But anyway, so our next recipe that I'm gonna do is a healthier version of a green bean casserole. So to start off with, I'm gonna be using fresh green beans. I don't know about you guys, but I personally hated green beans as a kid because I always had them canned. And I have no hatred against canned foods. They can definitely be a good option many times, but I personally do not like canned green beans. But fresh green beans are delicious. So we're gonna use fresh green beans. So I just got these. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna trim off some of the edges. So I'm gonna open this up. I think I only need to use about half of what I got here. Fresh green beans, as you'll see, it's not a great example, but a lot of them have like little stems on the end. So basically I'm just gonna go through really quickly and just kind of cut off the extra bits that I don't really want on there. So it's good if you can kind of try to line them up according to size, so you're not cutting off too much wastefulness, kind of just getting rid of like the very ends. I'm just gonna set those aside for now as I go through the rest of mine. Also, so we do a lot of grocery store tours. And so we always compare fresh versus canned versus frozen to see what the best cost is. And sometimes, not always, it depends on the time of the year. I honestly don't know off the top of my head when green beans are in season. But when they are, fresh green beans can be cheaper than frozen and canned. So I would definitely compare your unit prices. And if you haven't taken a Cooking Matters at the store yet, that's one of our topics for next spring as a sneak peek. So I would join that class. You can also cut these into smaller pieces if you want. Or basically just gonna be making a casserole out of them, so it doesn't super matter, but depends on your preference. This one also has a fun little leaf on it. So once I get all of my stems off of these guys, I'm just gonna blanch them really quickly. So if you've never blanched vegetables before, it's not something that I personally do super often, but it is a really good option to kind of affect the texture of whatever vegetable you're using. So generally speaking, the most often times I blanch is before I'm gonna freeze a vegetable. So if I have a lot of leftover vegetable, a lot of leftovers of a particular vegetable, and you kind of want it to kind of maintain the texture better, I would recommend blanching it before you freeze it. It kind of helps it maintain the texture and also the nutrition as well. And we're just gonna do that because these green beans are a little bit firm, and we want them to bake really nicely when I throw them in the oven. So we're gonna blanch them just to kind of pre-cook them ahead of time. So basically for blanching, we're just gonna boil them for a short period of time. And then we're going to throw them directly after we finish boiling them into an ice bath to stop the cooking, because we don't want them to cook completely. And then they're blanched and they're ready to go. All right. So I have all my green beans. I'm gonna go check my boiling water real quick. And it is almost there, but not quite. So I'm just gonna get rid of my ends to kind of clear off my cutting board here. And then, so the next thing I'm gonna add to this recipe is we're gonna use an onion and some cremini mushrooms. And you could use any mushrooms you like, or if you don't like mushrooms, you can also just leave them out, either way. But mushrooms are also super nutritious. Of course, they're a vegetable. They're one of a few sources of like naturally occurring vitamin D, besides, you know, like milk and dairy. So a good thing to include. So for my mushrooms here, I'm just gonna kind of slice them. And so if your mushrooms are super dirty, sometimes they have like soil and whatnot on top of them. I noticed these mushrooms that I got are pretty clean. There's really nothing on top of them, but if they were super dirty, I would just recommend getting like a paper towel and wetting it and kind of rubbing off the tops, as opposed to kind of like rinsing them like you would any other vegetable, because the mushrooms will just kind of soak up the water, and that'll definitely affect the texture of whatever you're using them for. So I'm just gonna slice these guys. I'm gonna use the entire package that I got here. And again, this serves about 8. So depending on your family size, this may be enough for you, or you may want to multiply it. Also, just as a heads up, I did send all the recipes that I'm cooking tonight, as well as a bunch of recipes from Cooking Matters. I did not send the recipes that Jessie is demoing tonight, but I will send those when I send the survey link. So if you like those recipes and you want to try them, I'll make sure we get those to you. This is also a little off topic, but I do have a degree in nutrition, and my like final project for, hold on, someone's, I want to get this out of the way.
Your video turned off, Taylor. Oh, there it is.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but your
Okay.
video's gone.
Can you see me again?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Anyway, I just wanted to mention, I feel like every person that gets a degree in nutrition has like one thing that they're like super passionate about. And my personal passion here is mushrooms. I did a whole like super long in-depth paper and like research about mushrooms. And they can actually, there's like a lot of studies to show that if you eat them regularly, they can prevent a bunch of different cancers. And I won't go into why, because it's like super in-depth and probably not very interesting. But if you do like mushrooms, I would recommend eating them. I think Jesse's nutrition geek out topic is fiber. So maybe she can mention that when she talks about the stuffing that she's going to make later.
And I will.
All right, so I got all my mushrooms sliced, and I'm just gonna put these back into my mushroom container for now. I'm gonna saute them here in just a second. I'm gonna check my boiling water real quick again. Because we're in Colorado, it takes a minute to boil, so I'll be right back. All right, we're almost there. So I'm also gonna dice up an onion. I'm using a yellow onion, which I do think I'd probably recommend most for this recipe. I feel like a red onion might be a little bit overpowering, but you could also use a white onion if you wanted, or even like shallots. So whichever you have in your household. So I usually leave one of the tops on, but both of the tops of that onion were kind of falling apart. So I cut off both ends. But the easiest way that I have found to dice an onion, I know some people like go through beforehand and like cut like parallel to their cutting board. I don't really find that necessary because, as you probably know, onions have layers. So they're already in there. I'm also probably gonna cry. Anyway, so I usually just cut the onion in half. I usually leave, like I mentioned, the top on just so it stays together. But you can also just cut it off if you hold it. But from there, I just kind of cut it. Kind of, there'll be like lines through the onion where the grooves are. So I kind of cut along those in like more or less like a centimeter. So I go through there, cut it lengthwise first. And for the ends, you'll kind of want to cut it at an angle using your bear claw. And then I line those about all up. If you have the top still on, they won't be falling apart, so you can skip that step. But then I just go back and cut it into dices. And since I cut the top off, they'll kind of fall apart. That's okay. And we'll do the other side here. I'm pretty sure the only time I ever cry cutting onions on class is like when I put eyeliner on. If I don't put eyeliner on, I don't cry. So I should have thought about that this morning. All right, and then we'll put our onion off to the side. I'm gonna go check our boiling water one more time here. All right, so that's boiling. So I'm just gonna go ahead and throw our trimmed green beans in there. And we're only gonna boil those for about like 4 to 5 minutes.
So you should there's everyone has a idea of a way to stop crying. I don't know that there is an actual way besides wearing goggles. I've heard you can put matches in your teeth and hold the end out to the sulfur should keep that gas away from your eyes. I've heard people cut them underwater, and I don't know how you would cut that underwater safely. I'm not sure. If anyone else has a tip for that, let us know. Put it in the chat. Yeah, goggles is funny. I've thought about that sometimes. I just feel like it's time for a good cry.
I just don't want to do it on camera, you know? Yeah, eyeliner running on my face. Happens every time. All right, so while my green beans are boiling, I'm just gonna prepare ice bath real quick. So basically, I put some ice in a bowl. I'm gonna add some cold water. And then I'm gonna put my colander inside this bowl so that when my green beans are done boiling, I'm just gonna put them right in here so that they stop dripping. So I'm gonna add some cold water. I'm just gonna set this aside until the green beans are done.
This is another way to, if your vegetables, like say you got some vegetables and they're going bad, if you want to freeze them, we recommend that you do this process first, put them in boiling water for just a few minutes before they actually cook, and then dump them in ice. And then you can dry them and put them in your freezer, and it makes them last a lot longer. So it's kind of a way to pre-cook things as well.
All right, so another thing I'm gonna chop up real quick is some garlic. I know Jesse just went over that. I'm gonna add about 3 cloves. If I can get it separated. Alright, so I'm just gonna press on it to kind of remove the skin here. And then I'm also gonna start preheating a pan on my stove. Again, whenever we're sauteing something, we want our pan to be hot before we add our oil. And then we want our oil to be hot before we add whatever we're cooking in there. That way, whatever like vegetable or meat or whatever doesn't just soak up all the fat and it actually cooks on the outside. And since I just recently moved, I used to have a gas stove and now I have an electric stove, and I've noticed it takes a lot longer to heat up than it used to. So just being aware of your cooking equipment and planning ahead. So we probably talked about this before, but I feel like onion and garlic are like a really good base for really tons and tons of recipes. They add a lot of flavor and kind of complement a lot of different other ingredients and herbs and things like that. So they're definitely a good thing to keep around in your kitchen if you do cook a lot. I'm gonna go rinse the garlic off my fingers real quick here.
Yeah, you should. That Trinity is the onion, bell pepper, and garlic. And then there's the French one is, I don't know, I believe it's celery, carrots, and onions is a mirepoix one. They put in the food in the South too, Cajun food.
It also took me a fairly long time to be like comfortable mincing garlic because it's like pretty small. And even if you have a stainless steel knife, like it tends to stick to your knife. So you can just take a garlic clove and like So that's another option as well. I'm just gonna mince my garlic here. Then basically what I'm gonna do, once I have all this ready, is I'm gonna saute my onion and my garlic together and then add the mushrooms and saute those. If you've never tried sauteing mushrooms and you don't like mushrooms, or if you do like mushrooms, I would still give it a try because they are delicious. Very different than if you've had them like raw or in something, or even roasted. I feel like it's pretty different. So I would try that. But it's basically you're just gonna add a little bit more flavor without adding like a bunch of cream and fat to our green bean casserole. And also adds nutrition, which is nice.
And garlic is also medicinal too. So not just nutrition, but it has cool chemical compounds in it that's good to help our immune systems.
Which is also good during these like winter seasons when I feel like everyone's always picking up colds and whatnot. All right, so these are ready to go. I feel like my green beans have boiled enough, so I'm gonna take those off the stove real quick. I'm just gonna add them to my ice bath, and then I'm gonna add some oil to my pan here so I can saute the rest of my vegetables. So I'm just gonna drain the boiling water from my boiled green beans first. And then once my green beans are in my colander, I'm just gonna transfer it directly to the ice bath and let those sit in there for like 2 minutes or so, just to let them cool and stop cooking. All right, so I'm gonna let my oil heat up for a second, and then I'm gonna add my onion and garlic. I'm gonna saute those for just a second. You wanna make sure your garlic doesn't burn because garlic does have a tendency to burn. So you just wanna keep an eye on that. And then I'm gonna add my mushrooms. And then from there, I'm gonna start creating the rest of my like casserole base. So usually if you're making green bean casserole, it calls for like cream of mushroom soup. So we're kind of creating like our own cream of mushroom soup. And just making it a little healthier because oftentimes that soup has like a lot of added fat and salt. So that's more or less what we're gonna do.
And if you are going to use the traditional one, cream of celery has a lot less saturated fat than cream of mushroom. I know it doesn't have that same flavor, but you can always add the mushrooms as well. But when you do it the way Taylor's doing it, you're also skipping all the salt and MSG kind of chemicals.
I feel like the reason why like the mushroom is so good in this recipe is because it has that like umami flavor. So that's definitely a good thing to add. And again, like I mentioned, mushrooms have lots of good health benefits. So, all right, so I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna transfer over my oil or I'm gonna transfer over my onion and my garlic into my heated oil here. And then I'm gonna switch over camera views really quickly. So we kind of just want to saute these for a couple minutes just to make sure that these start to get a little translucent. It's kind of when we know that's good to go. I also think my sweet potato casserole down here is ready. So as you can see, the top here is like a little bit browned. The sweet potatoes, have, like Josie mentioned, have kind of caramelized to the side here. So it's ready to go. And my onions here are still cooking. One thing that I feel like I really need to get here soon is a bigger pan, because this is like literally the biggest pan I have. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna add my mushrooms and start sauteing those. From here, so the next thing I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna kind of make the rest of like the cream of mushroom type soup that we're gonna add to it. So I'm just gonna go ahead, I'm just gonna mix this all in a measuring cup so it's ready to go so you guys can see it. It's a little bit different than the directions I sent you, but it's still gonna work just fine. So I'm just gonna add that to the mushrooms, onion, and garlic that I have sauteing. I'm just gonna cook that all together. And that's basically gonna be the moisture part of the casserole that I'm making. So I'm gonna add some soy sauce. So it is, let's see here. It's gonna be a tablespoon of soy sauce. I'm using a reduced sodium version. You can also use like coconut aminos that taste pretty similar to soy sauce. Kind of reducing the amount of extra sodium you're getting here. So I'm gonna add in that. And then it calls for chicken broth. I'm gonna use vegetable broth because that's what I have. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that as well. So it calls for half a cup. And then we are going to mix, so we're basically gonna make a thickener. So I'm gonna use some arrowroot powder and a little bit of water, but you could also use just cornstarch if you don't have this. So it should be the same ratio. So I'm gonna add sorry, it's been a while since I made this recipe. I'm gonna add 2 tablespoons of this and 2 tablespoons of water, and I'm just gonna mix that together. And basically what that is gonna do is just kind of thicken the ultimate result of what we're making here. So I'm gonna go grab a bowl real quick and do that. So
Are you using the arrowroot instead of cornstarch? I missed that.
Yes.
Okay.
So the recipe that I sent does call for arrowroot. I happen to have that in my kitchen, but yeah, like I mentioned, you can also use cornstarch. I feel like that's more of a common ingredient than the arrowroot, but they do the same thing. It's basically just a thickener.